All right, my name is Rachael Woody. I'm here with Don Graves, and it's June 14th, 2014, and we're in Dallesport, Washington at Graves Vineyards. And Don, my first question for you is why wine? Why wine? Why grape growing?
Well, I got started in the grape business. I worked for Bonneville Power for 30-some years. And during that time, I met Dr. Kloor from Washington State College. And he's the man who introduced the wine grapes to the Northwest. A very nice man, a very nice guy. Well, he got me interested in growing wine grapes. And we've established about a half-acre vineyard here in the late 50s and early 60s. And we just grew from that. All the wines we put in, all the varieties, did very well. And Dr. Kloor thought this was an ideal setup for wine grapes, a growing area for wine grapes. And have just progressed since then. Expanded the vineyard, and I had 20 acres here of my own, and I got it all planted in grapes. I don't know what else I can tell you about the starting of it, but that's pretty much how it got started. And when I first got started, there weren't many home wine makers, and there weren't many wineries in the area. Chuck Henderson and I started this winery in Bingen, Bingen Wine Cellars. And we did very well for several years until Chuck wanted it all. And he owned more of it than I did, so he bought me out. And I just continued to work at Bonneville until, I don't know, I don't remember what year it was that I retired from there, but I just expanded my vineyard, and I never went back in the wine business because I had enough obligation or enough work to do at home here. We raised our children right here. We had 5 children, and all very successful. And they've been a big help to us, and to me especially. I had 3 boys that just loved to work out in the vineyard. You know how that goes. But they did a good job and helped me considerable. And we just expanded from that and continued on. I sold the wine to new wineries that came in, and I had a lot of home winemakers that loved to make good wine. And my object was to furnish them the best wines, best grapes that I could possibly do it, and it turned out very well. Now, what else would I like to explain?
What grapes did you start with?
I started with Grenache. And they are very vigorous and very good growing grape, but there was no demand for Grenache back 40 years ago. there were no wineries that made Grenache. But in the later years, I pulled many of the Grenache out and replanted with more popular varieties, the Cabernet and the Syrah and the Merlot were all in demand. But later on, now the Grenache is a very popular wine, and it makes a very nice wine.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to look down the road 4 or 5 years and know what's going to be in demand. You can do all the reading you want about France and Italy and all the big wine countries, but that doesn't mean they're going to be popular here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. About 1965, somewhere in those, along in there, we took a trip over to France and Italy and went through their vineyards and had a very educational program. Some of those wineries were 100 years old at that time, and we didn't have anything like that in this country at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so
what was it like to start a vineyard? Did you have much experience before that?
no, not in the I was in the sheep business for many years before that. I graduated from Yakima High, and this was when the war was just getting started, and I was drafted in 1921. But I joined the Air Force, and I was in the Air Force for 5 years during the war. But I didn't get in combat. I did a lot of training in California, took pilot training and all sorts of helicopter or gliders. We didn't have any helicopters at that time. And then I just came back, and I had this great desire. I like to work. That was kind of dumb, but that's what I did. And with Dr. Kloor's knowledge of how to set up a winery and how to set up a vineyard, that's how I started from there. And did most all the work, but I lived close to my job, and so I always had early morning and late evenings to work. And I had some boys that helped me considerable. And it had worked out quite well.
How did you first meet Dr. Kloor?
You know, I'm not sure. I just can't remember that well back.
I think Chuck told us that Dr. Kloor just found you two and convinced you to grow grapes. Does that sound?
That's pretty much right, I think. But as I say, I can't remember the exact details on how I first met Dr. Kloor. But he would come by quite often, and always full of knowledge. My wife has been a big help to me. She keeps, where is she?
She just wandered off?
Just wandered off.
Did she help out in the vineyard too?
Pardon?
Did she help out in the vineyard too?
No, not so much in the vineyard, but of course I said we had 5 children and she was pretty busy all the time.
Right.
Taking care of that. And then she worked at the school. She was a secretary to the administrator for, I don't know, good many years. Mm-hmm. And it worked out quite well.
So I know it was you and Chuck for a long time. Do you remember who some of the other early grape growers were? I think Cliff Blanchette, I've heard his name, Dong Flerschinger.
No, when I started this, there were no vineyards in this area. I couldn't go to my neighbors or anybody and see how things were done. There just weren't. There was one vineyard in the Dalles. It was an old established, but I didn't like the way they did their training and one thing and another, and, you know. So I didn't copy any of their methods.
Well, it seems to have worked out for you. You have beautiful vines. Coming in, we saw them, old and beautiful.
Thank you. And I've tried to keep the yield down to about 3 to 3.5 tons. And that's been about the average over the years. I got established with several wineries that used my grapes for many years.
What are your thoughts on how the wine industry has changed since when you first planted to now?
Well, the main thing I think is the knowledge of the wine drinkers. You know, the demand for good wines. You know, 40, 50 years ago, you'd mention drinking a bottle of wine or a glass of wine and, well, they'd turn up their nose. Now it's different. There's a big demand, and the public became well educated on good wines. And, you know, now this is pretty much the way it was in France and Italy when we were there. They drank wine on every occasion, at mealtime and in between meals, and and now America, there's a lot of that goes on today. So.
One thing I've read in my research is World War II had a lot to do with Americans being exposed to European culture in the sense of drinking wine as part of the pleasure of the meal. Since you were in World War II, did you find that to be the case?
No. I never was much of a boozer, but when I was in the service, there was a lot of drinking going on. But I don't remember drinking many wines, but I never got across, I never was over in the wine country.
Okay.
So, what else can I?
I would love to hear more about the vineyard. Looking back, is there anything you would do differently, or would you try something else out? What did you learn, I guess, from starting it, being one of the first to start?
Well, I would have gone in bigger and taken on more properties if I would have known the wine industry would going to expand like it had, you know. But I didn't have that foresight to see that, you know, the vineyard is going to grow up all over. Mm-hmm. You know, there's people in the hills and Hood River and the Dalles and Goldendale. Now, Walla Walla was the first area in the state to really get involved in the wine industry. But we had some terribly, terribly cold winters, and it pretty well wiped them out. Mm. In 1949, it got to 25 below here. I walked across the Columbia River here.
Really?
Yeah, it froze.
Wow.
Yeah. We lived at Lyle at that time. And anybody that didn't have, well, the weather was just so severe that it took out a lot of the cherries and a lot of the, and there were not any, but the Walla Walla area was hit the hardest on the grape, and they've never recovered that. They're doing a good job now up in that area, but they went quite a number of years without any grapes. It's kind of devastating when you get completely wiped out. Mm-hmm. You know. Now I don't know. Don't foresee any weather as severe as that, but we might. I just don't know.
Having spent so much time in this area, how have you seen it develop? It's always been a bit more agricultural focused. Do you think that will continue? Do you think grapes will be the primary agriculture eventually?
Well, I think there'll be more and more vineyards go in. I don't know if they'll ever be the prime. Grapes are very popular in this area. Or did I say grapes?
Yeah.
I meant cherries. And it seems to be a very good area for cherries, and they have developed the markets all over the world for these cherries.
Can I ask you another question about the vineyard?
Sure.
You had mentioned before you were selling grapes to some of the bigger winemakers. How did you go about finding buyers for your grapes, and how did you get them to market, I guess? What was that like?
Well, once the first grapes that we made wine with went to the college. George Carter was the winemaker at Washington State College at Pullman, and they put out a lot of newsletters, and more people became interested in wines, and I didn't have a tremendous amount. You know, I didn't start out with 40 or 50 tons by any means, but the knowledge of winemaking and good quality grapes became more of an well, it became more knowledgeable, and there were lots of magazines and lots of articles on grapes that came out, and more people became interested.
You may not know the answer to this, but do you know why Dr. Kloor was so interested in grapes?
Well, he was a professor at the college. And I don't know much about his background, but he was hired there as a viniculturist at the college, and he had studied grape growing all over the world, and knowledge of winemaking, and just how he himself got interested in grapes, I don't know the answer to that, but he was a very nice man, a very likable man. Yeah.
I just find it fascinating that he seemed to seek you and Chuck out and sort of convince you to start growing grapes, which was kind of not a thing done out here at that time. At least not for 100 years, I guess, with the pioneers.
Yeah. Well, I really don't know the answer to that, but I do know that Dr. Kloor was very interested in the expansion of the wine industry in the Northwest. He thought we had some of the best growing conditions and the best areas, right amount of sunshine and the good soils and what it takes to grow good grapes. Does that answer most all your...
It does. In fact, are there any stories that you'd like to share with us, or anything that I should have asked that I didn't?
No. Not that I can think of.
Fair enough.
Over the years, I just tried to improve and grow the grapes up to the right analysis for making good wines. And it's worked out quite well. It's been very, been very successful as far as I'm concerned, but after I retired from Bonneville, it gave me more time to work in the vineyard, and I did most all the pruning myself for the first few years, but now I don't. Well, I've run out of energy, I'm worthless. You know, you get to that point in life.
Do your sons help manage the vineyards now?
Yes, my middle boy does. My oldest son, when he was just going to school and one thing and another, he was a good worker. But later on in life, he got into construction business, and then he went to Alaska, and he had an accident up there which took his life.
I'm sorry.
He had been married and had 2 children, 2 daughters. But he was very, very successful in life. And the middle boy, Doug, which he lives across the road now, started a business there in Vancouver. And he lived just north of Vancouver. The devil's the name of that community. But anyhow, Doug was in, and he retired from that 2 or 3 years ago, and we deeded him some property, and he built a very nice home across the street. And he has pretty well taken over the vineyard.
Nice.
He's a good worker, good head on him.
You must have done something right.
Yeah. And our youngest son lives in White Salmon. He works for PUD, and he's 50, I don't know, 50 some years old, about ready to retire. Yeah, he's been with them that long, and does a good job. And our daughter, our oldest daughter, lives right across the street too. She is married to Tim Ernest. Ernest Motors.
Oh, okay.
In the Dalles, but Robin has been a big help to her. She's a worker. She was during harvest and all times while she's right in the middle of it. So it all worked out quite well to have somebody that you could rely on and had some interest in it also.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, anything else?
No, that's about the best I can do with what little.
You did wonderfully. Actually, I loved your answers, so thank you so much for your time.
Well, you're welcome.